September 4th, 1944. The British 11th Armored Division rolled into the Belgian port city of Antwerp, expecting a ruin. In this war, whenever the Germans gave up a major port, they usually left it as a cratered shell. Docks shattered, cranes toppled into the water, warehouses burning, channels choked with wreckage. Antwerp should have looked like that. Instead, it looked like a miracle. The harbor was intact. The docks were usable. The cranes still stood. The warehouses were ready. And the scale of what had just fallen into Allied hands was hard to process. Europe's second-largest port, and after Rotterdam's destruction in 1940, the biggest intact port in Western Europe, built to push tens of thousands of tons of supplies a day, with rail lines that could feed armies straight toward Germany. If the Allied advance had been a race, Antwerp was the one fuel station that could keep the engines running without pause. It was the one asset that could turn speed into victory. It was the kind of prize that could shorten the war. The kind of prize that could get men home before Christmas. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery didn't waste time announcing it. He messaged Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower with the kind of confidence that sounds like destiny. Antwerp captured intact, port facilities undamaged, ready for immediate use. Eisenhower, who had spent months staring at tonnage charts and fuel curves like they were battle maps, was stunned. Everyone at the top knew the truth the headlines never showed. The front line could move only as fast as the supply line. For weeks, the armies had surged forward so quickly that logistics were being dragged behind them like a chain. Trucks were wearing out. Fuel was running short. Ammunition was thinning. Spare parts were disappearing into the mud of long roads. But Antwerp could fix it. Antwerp could swallow the entire Allied supply crisis in one bite. Or it could have, because Antwerp's miracle had a lock on it. The port sat deep inland, and ships didn't teleport into docks. They had to come in through the Scheldt Estuary, a winding approach from the North Sea that threaded through marshland, islands, narrow channels, and deadly choke points. Every mile of that approach was controlled by German forces. On the southern bank, the German 15th Army held fortified positions. On the northern approaches, German troops occupied Walcheren Island and South Beveland, turning the waterway into a shooting gallery. Coastal artillery could cover shipping lanes. Mines could turn channels into steel traps. Fortifications and fields of fire could make any attempt at passage suicidal. Until those guns were silenced, those mines swept, those strong points crushed. Antwerp was a beautiful, useless trophy. A port you couldn't use. A miracle you couldn't touch. Montgomery was told this immediately. On September 5th, the day after the city fell, his intelligence officers laid it out in plain terms. The port could not be used until the approaches were cleared, until German artillery was eliminated, until the estuary was opened. Montgomery understood. He nodded. He acknowledged the problem. Then he made a choice that left his staff staring at one another as if they'd misheard him. Antwerp could wait. Something else would come first. To understand why, you have to feel the speed of those days. Montgomery's 21st Army Group had surged across Belgium and northern France, pushing roughly 250 miles in about 2 weeks. Brussels had been liberated on September 3rd. Antwerp had been taken on September 4th. German units were retreating, scattered, battered, and exhausted. To Montgomery, it looked like collapse. To Montgomery, this was the moment to end it with one more bold stroke, one dramatic thrust that would put his name in the final sentence of the war. One airborne assault to seize bridges, crack open the Netherlands, and drive a spearhead over the Rhine into Germany's industrial heartland. Operation Market Garden. His staff raised the questions that seem obvious in hindsight, but sound like heresy in the glow of victory. What about the Scheldt? What about opening Antwerp? What about securing the supply line before launching a new offensive that would demand fuel, ammunition, aircraft, and priority? Montgomery brushed the concerns aside. "The Germans are beaten," he insisted. "Momentum is everything. Strike now before they can reorganize. Market Garden takes priority. Antwerp, the unglamorous task of clearing islands and flooded lowlands, could wait. He wanted a masterpiece, not a maintenance job. But Market Garden required Eisenhower's blessing. And more than that, it required Eisenhower's resources. It would need 3 Allied airborne divisions. It would need priority in fuel and ammunition. It would need control of Allied air forces. It would need the kind of commitment that would starve other parts of the front and gamble everything on one northern corridor. Eisenhower's strategy, at least in theory, was a broad front. Advance on multiple axes. Keep pressure everywhere. Deny the Germans the ability to concentrate. Montgomery's plan asked him to do the opposite. Concentrate for a decisive blow. Eisenhower was skeptical, but Montgomery sold it with the absolute certainty of a man who sees history opening like a door. "Give me the resources," Montgomery argued, "and I'll be in Berlin by Christmas. I'll end the war this year." Eisenhower approved on September 10th. Market Garden would go forward. Montgomery got priority for supplies. 3 airborne divisions were assigned. Air power was committed. And in that moment, something quiet but deadly happened. Neither man issued the order that should have been automatic. Clear the Scheldt. Open Antwerp. They treated it like a chore that could be done later, after the glory. It was not a chore. It was the hinge on which the entire campaign could swing. By mid-September, the Allied supply situation was already bending toward crisis. The advance had outrun its own lifeline. Normandy, those beaches and the port of Cherbourg, still carried the weight, hundreds of miles behind the front. Every gallon of fuel had to be hauled forward by truck. Every ration, every artillery shell, every replacement tire, engine part, and radio battery. The trucks burned fuel to bring fuel. The system was devouring itself. When the weather turned, roads turned to sludge. Vehicles broke. Schedules slipped. What looked like unstoppable momentum began to feel like a machine coughing as it climbed a hill. No commander felt the choke like George Patton. His Third Army had raced across France, its crews living on adrenaline and speed, convinced the Germans were running out of breath. But now, east of Paris, Patton's tanks sat idle. Not because the enemy stopped them, but because fuel didn't arrive. A Sherman without gasoline is not a spear. It's a heavy steel bunker sitting in the rain. Patton raged at the injustice of it, at the idea that they could be driving into Germany, and instead were parked like an army in storage. Meanwhile, other formations were told to conserve ammunition, to limit artillery fire, to count machine gun bursts. The front line was hungry, and the kitchen was hundreds of miles away. And the solution sat right there in Belgium, like a locked treasure chest. Antwerp, capable of handling tens of thousands of tons daily, far closer to the front, connected by rails that could move supplies straight to the armies. But Antwerp's docks stayed empty. No ships reached them. The estuary remained in German hands. Montgomery's army group received the priority allocation because everything was being funneled into Market Garden. American forces were told to consolidate, defend, wait, hold position while Montgomery attempted his decisive thrust. Patton protested furiously, warning they were being starved for an operation that didn't even solve the supply problem. Eisenhower held firm. Market Garden would launch on September 17th. When it succeeded, the strategic picture would change. September 17th arrived, and the sky filled with parachutes. 3 airborne divisions dropped into Holland in what became the largest airborne operation in military history. The 101st went near Eindhoven. The 82nd went near Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne went to Arnhem. The plan was elegant on paper. Seize bridges over rivers and canals, build a corridor, and let British ground forces race up a single highway into Germany. If it worked, Montgomery said, the war would be over in weeks. It didn't work. German resistance was harder than predicted. Intelligence had underestimated what was recovering in the Netherlands. That single highway became a funnel, and a funnel becomes a killing ground when the enemy can cut it with artillery, ambush it with armor, and choke it with blown bridges and destroyed vehicles. At Arnhem, the British airborne troops fought with a kind of courage that becomes legend only because it's paid for in blood. They were surrounded. They were pounded. They were overwhelmed. The relief couldn't arrive fast enough. The operation collapsed after days of fighting that felt like weeks. The casualties were devastating. Tens of thousands killed, wounded, or captured. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed, and the Rhine crossings stayed out of reach. Montgomery, faced with the wreckage of his grand gamble, declared it 90% successful. Valuable ground, he insisted, had been gained. Lessons had been learned. He did not treat it like the disaster it was. Meanwhile, back at Antwerp, the port still sat silent. The miracle still sat locked. The price of that delay wasn't a headline yet. It was a slow bleed across the entire front, a widening gap between what Allied armies wanted to do and what they were actually able to do. By early October, reality had arrived like cold rain. The German army had not collapsed. The war would not end before the year was out. Winter was coming, and Allied armies were still fighting in France and Belgium rather than driving deep into Germany. Eisenhower called his commanders together, and the conversation turned to logistics: how to sustain operations through winter, how to prepare for spring, how to keep the entire theater from grinding to a halt. The answer sat in everyone's mind. Antwerp. Open it. Clear the Scheldt. Let ships bring supplies directly into Belgium, instead of hauling everything from Normandy. When Montgomery was asked why the approaches still hadn't been cleared, he explained his forces had been committed to Market Garden, and clearing the estuary would require time and resources because the Germans were strongly fortified. Eisenhower's patience snapped. He had given Montgomery priority. The operation failed. Now Antwerp had to be opened. It wasn't optional. It was survival. Montgomery agreed, and he assigned the Canadian First Army to the task. But the calendar had already been bleeding away. Antwerp had been captured on September 4th. Weeks had passed. The miracle port had sat useless while armies went short. The Canadians received orders in mid-October, and what they walked into was not a clean battle of maneuvers. It was a nightmare landscape, low-lying ground reclaimed from the sea, braided with canals, ringed with high dikes, and vulnerable to flooding. The Germans made the terrain itself a weapon. They destroyed dikes and turned fields into waterlogged traps. Canadian infantry advanced through mud and freezing water, fighting for villages that barely rose above the flooded plain. Tanks could not maneuver off the narrow dikes without sinking, and on the dikes they were silhouettes against the sky, targets that drew fire like magnets. There were no foxholes because digging meant hitting water almost immediately. There was little cover because the land was flat as a table. Wounded men didn't always fall onto dry ground. They slid into mud and freezing water, sometimes drowning before help could reach them. The enemy could be invisible until the water around you started snapping with machine gun fire. Concrete bunkers had to be taken one at a time, often at point-blank range. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Artillery hammered positions that refused to die quickly. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. What Montgomery had implied might take weeks, stretched, grinding and costly, into November. Casualties mounted. Entire units were chewed down by terrain, weather, and German defense. On Walcheren Island and the South Beveland Peninsula, the fighting became its own brutal chapter, one many people would forget later because it lacked glamour. It wasn't a dramatic dash toward Berlin. It was drowning mud, cold hands, wet weapons, and men pushing forward because the port had to open. The German defenders understood exactly what they were doing. As long as they held the estuary, Antwerp stayed useless. As long as Antwerp stayed useless, Allied supply lines stayed stretched. As long as supply lines stayed stretched, Allied offensives stayed limited. They fought to buy time. Time for Germany to build winter defenses. Time to regroup battered formations. Time to plan something that could change the entire war's tempo. Finally, on November 8th, Canadian forces secured Walcheren. The last German positions controlling the Scheldt were captured. But even then, Antwerp wasn't instantly unlocked. The channels still had mines. Every approach had to be swept. Every route verified safe. Minesweepers began the slow, methodical work that never appears in heroic paintings, but decides whether ships live or die. And then, on November 28th, a Liberty ship entered Antwerp harbor. It was the first Allied vessel to reach the port since its capture. The docks that had sat empty for nearly 3 months finally started receiving cargo. Nearly 3 months. Think about that. From September 4th, when the British captured the intact port, to late November, when the first supply ship arrived, Antwerp sat like a sealed vault. For almost 3 months, the Allies possessed the one logistical weapon that could have powered a relentless advance, and they couldn't use it. The lost potential was staggering. Day after day, when fuel could have been flowing closer to the front. Day after day, when ammunition could have been arriving in bulk. Day after day, when spare parts and winter clothing and medical supplies could have been moved by rail rather than hauled across exhausted roads. Day after day, when the Germans, watching the pause, realized something important. The Allies had momentum, but they were not sustaining pressure. They were breathing. They were waiting. And waiting gives the enemy time to sharpen knives. Montgomery never truly acknowledged that prioritizing Market Garden over opening Antwerp was a mistake. In public, he defended his decisions. In his memoirs, he would later compress the Antwerp delay into barely a passing mention, while arguing that Market Garden was almost a triumph, that it would have worked if he'd been given more resources, that German resistance had been unexpectedly strong. But the consequences didn't care about arguments. By the time Antwerp began operating, the strategic situation had changed. The easy late summer advances were gone. German defenses had stiffened. Weather was turning ugly. Winter warfare was about to begin, and in the Ardennes forest, something was quietly assembling. Hitler had been watching the Allied pause with the hunger of a gambler who sees the other player blink. Germany's supply situation was collapsing, its reserves thinning, its fronts strained. But Hitler didn't need to win the war anymore. He needed to change it. He needed one blow that could split the Allied armies, shake their morale, and force negotiations. He needed a counteroffensive that would strike where the Allied line was thin and where weather could ground air power. The Ardennes, in winter, offered that chance. The delay at Antwerp had helped create it. Not because Antwerp alone decided everything, but because the port's absence had stretched Allied logistics, limited sustained offensives, and allowed German forces breathing room. Time to reorganize. Time to move units. Time to hide preparations behind forests and winter storms. Time to plan the attack that would become the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces crashed forward through thinly defended American positions. The assault achieved surprise. Entire battalions were hit hard in the first 2 days. Communications broke. Supply dumps were captured. A bulge formed in the Allied line as German armor and infantry pushed into the gap. Hitler had not chosen December by accident. Antwerp had only been open for a few weeks and was still building toward full capacity. Allied armies were stretched across a wide front. German intelligence had monitored Allied logistics through the fall, the fuel shortages, the ammunition rationing, the operational pauses. The Ardennes attack was wildly ambitious and ultimately doomed, but it succeeded in its immediate purpose. It inflicted enormous casualties, created chaos, and extended the war. The human cost is the part that can't be captured in supply charts. Teenaged riflemen shivered in cold forests with inadequate clothing. Units fought with ammunition that had to be rationed. Medical supplies ran low. The battle dragged on through brutal winter conditions, and tens of thousands of Americans became casualties, with many thousands killed. It took weeks of desperate fighting to crush the bulge and restore the line. The Allies eventually stabilized, counterattacked, and resumed their advance into Germany. But time had been lost, and lives had been spent in conditions made worse by a logistical strain that had been prolonged across the fall. The empty port's cost wasn't paid in paperwork. It was paid in frozen woods and shattered platoons. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated German generals and staff chiefs, trying to understand how Germany had assembled such a powerful attack force so late in 1944. They asked when serious planning began, and the answers were revealing. The concept, they were told, was announced in mid-September, right when the Allies had surged into Belgium and captured Antwerp, and right when German observers noticed the Allies did not immediately open it. Plans were refined once it became clear Allied advances had stalled, and supply problems were limiting sustained pressure. German commanders emphasized that September and early October had been the critical window, when Germany's western defenses were most vulnerable, when sustained Allied offensives might have prevented reorganization, when the momentum from the summer breakout could have been carried straight into Germany. Instead, the Allies paused. Resources were consumed by Market Garden. The Scheldt remained closed. The Germans used the time. One point from those interrogations stung especially hard. German commanders were shocked when Antwerp wasn't opened immediately. They assumed the Allies would treat clearing the estuary as the top priority because it was so obviously decisive. When weeks passed without a major effort, German planners realized they'd been handed an opportunity. They were asked directly whether an Ardennes offensive could have been launched if Allied supplies had been flowing freely through Antwerp in October and November. The answer was blunt: no. With full Allied pressure sustained across the front, Germany would not have had the space to assemble reserves for a major counterattack. Eisenhower spent much of his life defending the decision to approve Market Garden before ensuring Antwerp was opened. He argued that the plan had merit, that crossing the Rhine in September was worth the risk, and that no one could have predicted the operation would fail as it did. Critics replied that Antwerp's importance was obvious from the day it fell, and the need to clear the estuary was apparent to every staff officer who understood logistics. The supply crisis was not theoretical. It was crippling. Opening the port should have been the first priority before launching any new offensive that demanded massive supply concentration. Eisenhower's counter-argument was never purely military, because the war wasn't purely military. He had to manage an alliance. Montgomery was Britain's most prominent field commander. Refusing him resources risked political rupture. Churchill was sensitive about British prestige. Coalition warfare meant balancing egos, priorities, and national pride. Eisenhower chose harmony over operational clarity, and in doing so, he absorbed part of the blame. Montgomery, for his part, clung to his narrative. In his view, Market Garden was almost a triumph, and the Antwerp delay was an unfortunate detail. Some historians have been far less forgiving, arguing that the decision to chase spectacular operations over unglamorous logistics was one of the major strategic errors of the campaign. Clearing the Scheldt was miserable infantry fighting in flooded terrain, the kind of job that doesn't produce dramatic photographs or tidy arrows on a map. It wouldn't make Montgomery the man who won the war with a daring maneuver. But it was precisely the kind of job that wins wars in the real world. Because wars are not won only by bold thrusts and brilliant plans. They are won by fuel arriving on time, by ammunition reaching batteries before an attack stalls, by spare parts keeping trucks and tanks rolling, by winter, clothing arriving before winter kills men as surely as bullets. When Antwerp sat locked, the consequences radiated outward. Patton's stalled armor, rationed artillery, limited offensives, exhausted transport columns, and a wider front that could not be sustained with the pressure it needed. While Allied armies paused, German forces escaped destruction, withdrew into prepared positions, rebuilt shattered units, and planned one last gamble. That gamble failed in the long run, but it succeeded in making the war longer and bloodier than it might have been. And that is the cruel irony of Antwerp. On September 4, 1944, the Allies seized a miracle, the one port that could have solved their most dangerous problem at the most critical moment. It fell into their hands intact, ready, waiting. But a miracle with a locked door is just another silent building by the water. Montgomery chose glory over logistics, and by the time the lock was finally broken, the easy season was gone. The war continued into winter. Men fought and died in freezing forests. And the cost of that empty port, those weeks of delay, that wasted advantage, was written not in tonnage, but in lives.